we've got a couple more to join, but I'll just run through the technical how to use Zoom for anybody who's unfamiliar. So I've got control. So if your phone starts ringing by accident, I can mute you. So don't panic, especially if you know, if you're not used to Zoom. But try and put yourself on mute if you can. And basically, if you look down if you use your mouse and run along the bottom of your screen, bottom left, you'll see a mute button. And if you want to stop your video for whatever reason, that's the next icon. And then the only other one you'll probably need to use is chat. So what we're going to do is, if you've got any questions, if you're not on video, put your question into chat. If you are on video, either use chat or stick your hand up, and then hopefully we'll be able to identify you if you've got any questions. But I'll be watching the chat all the way through, so if you want to send any message to me privately, do. We're recording this as well, so anybody who wants it, we can send the recording afterwards. Yeah, I think, well, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Katie, and Katie Bliss is going to, who's the Knowledge Exchange Manager for Agri-ecology, is going to take you through, well, she's going to chair today, and then she's going to hand over to our speakers. So Katie, over to you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you're enjoying your hampers. Can you all see that screen that Lydia, my colleague, is sharing with you there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. I'm an agroecologist. I work with the Agri-ecology team. So we've also got Tim, Field, Janie, and Lydia, and you'll hear a bit from them later as well, I imagine. So this morning is firstly Agri-ecology and our response during this time of social distancing to support the farming community. We'll hear from 3 farmers their approach to manage the winter, and demonstrating really the kind of practical discussions that we intend to host this summer when we can't get out into the field. So we're trying to recreate that experience and provide a second best, really. And then, as Jay mentioned, we'll open up for questions at the end. So if you could click the next slide, please, Lydia. So to set the context a bit, there's this increasing recognition of multiple challenges that are facing agriculture, with this climatic shocks in terms of extremes of weather. Extremes of weather obviously always impacted farming, but we're really seeing these extremes, and also other agronomic shocks with things like resistant black grass, antibiotic resistance, is causing farmers to reevaluate their farm systems and alternative approaches that enhance that resilience and to withstand those shocks, efficiency and sustainability in the system. We're seeing a lot of farmers to more integrated agri-ecological approaches to managing these issues, and looking at it from a kind of whole systems approach. And so agroecology is a whole systems approach of applying ecological concepts to management of agricultural systems, that can be applied by all farmers and growers. So it's of labels, and that's really kind of bridging across the sector of people sharing ideas and knowledge in terms of how they're making work. So next slide, please, Lydia. And so Agri-ecology is a network of farmers and researchers and advisors sharing knowledge on agroecological approaches. Look to support all farmers to use these techniques and learn how to use them on their farm. It's really, there's no kind of one size fits all, so it's all about people learning from each other, and that's between farmers and between farmers and researchers. So we're doing that online and also in the field normally. So we're kind of combining that digital element with on-farm, in-field events and discussions. Next slide, please, Lydia. And that's a cross-sector collaboration. So we are a partnership of over 40 different organisations, bringing together that practical experience and research knowledge of new innovations within agroecological farming, and all bringing that together in one place. So you've got a bit of a sample there of the people that we're working with. Next slide, please. And so what we do is really bringing together, sharing that farm experience. So farmers demonstrating agroecology in practice on their farms, and that's throughout the UK in horticulture, livestock and arable systems. And then bringing together that research evidence with that. So working with researchers who are sharing kind of informally their research in blogs, but also in synthesis in technical guides and decision support tools in our online library. So we've got a huge resource of information there, all available for free. We're also working with podcasts and videos. We've got over 320 videos on our YouTube channel that's bringing together those latest ideas and opinions from the field. So as we can see here, really that joy of the video is having that visual information and being able to see what's happening in each other's fields. And then we also have field days and discussions in partnership with big field events like Round Farm Cereals and on social media. Yep, next slide, please. And so the situation that we find ourselves in is clearly really necessitating a dramatic response and really shifting how people are communicating, as we're seeing now, and connect with each other, and also really enhances this risk of socialisation, which is already an issue in the farming community. So at Agri-ecology, working together with all of our partners, we look to pull together a response to support isolating farmers, to provide an opportunity to connect with each other, to keep learning, and to kind of try to fill a bit of the void that we're going to see this summer with all of the field events and farm walks and things being cancelled. So we're putting together a calendar of events online and podcasts and videos, all of which will be available on our website. Firstly, the website itself is a huge resource of information, so I just want to let people know that it's there. But as events across the country are cancelled and postponed, we'll work with our partners to take the farm walks and events online. So we've got virtual field days. We've got a calendar of virtual field days. We were planning to do them on farms around the country in partnership with CFE and LEAF. So we've got Laura from CFE and Caroline from LEAF on the phone, and Becky from WAG. And so we'll be taking that online with Zoom calls like we're doing today. So participants can interact on a webinar. We'll go on a virtual walk around the farm to different stops on the farm and go on a virtual tour. So participants can interact on that webinar or dial in or watch on YouTube Live, and they'll also be recorded and available later. So there's a bit of a snapshot of some of the ones we've got coming up. So the 28th of April, we've got First Steps to Agri-ecological Farming, where we'll be bringing together 3 farmers that are will share their experience of how they've moved on this journey and the challenges they've overcome and the benefits that they've seen to kind of support other people that are thinking to do the same. One on intercropping in arable systems, multi-species lathes in partnership with FWAG. And then also CFE are planning an event on the 6th of May on trees and carbon, and LEAF on IPM in arable systems. And we're also exploring a partnership with the James Hutton Institute to allow for more virtual farm experience. So we'll be piloting that with them as well. We're also doing virtual discussions. So in collaboration with major field events, including Cereals and NOC, So we often at these events have had these kind of informal discussions. So we're looking to take those online short webinars that will also be made into the podcast. So that will be an opportunity for questions and answers on key agroecological practices and themes, and for participants to engage in that and share their own experiences. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, so as I said, we'll be pulling together a calendar of virtual events together with all of our partners as well, and that will include webinars, conferences, trainings, working with the Farming Forum as well. So all of those will be available on our website, so you can find them there. Next slide. And we'll continue to work with video. So we'll be working with farmers and researchers to make and share their own videos. So Richard Smith, who we'll hear from a bit later on, is a regular guest vlogger, but we'll also be working with other people to create short video blogs to share what they're learning in the field, and enable that connection with other members of the community, and bringing together videos from across the sector on our YouTube channel. And then we're also launching a podcast. So we'll have two formats there. One will be with a farmer profile, so interviewing one farmer on the different practices they've got on farm and their whole system, and one on specific practices, and enabling discussions there. So all of that will be shared on podcast platforms and the website. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, all of this will be brought together on our website. If you haven't been there, it's www.agri-ecology.co.uk. And just encourage you all to take a look, get involved, and to encourage your audience to use this free online resource during lockdown. And yeah, to take a look at that. And so I guess as a means to demonstrate the kind of thing we're looking to pull together, we've invited 3 farmers from our community who are putting agroecology into practice, to talk a bit about how they've handled extreme weather conditions this winter, and how, yeah, this winter had, oh, I've got a question here. Yes, that everything will remain free and after lockdown. So everything's free, it's all freely available. And if people want to subscribe, we have got a newsletter, we have different themes each month. And yes, you can subscribe on the website and you'll receive an update each month. Thank you. Yeah, so these extreme weather conditions this autumn and spring have posed serious implications to agricultural activities. And last month's newsletter in our theme on agroecology was looking at how the farming community is reacting to that and seeking to increase farm resilience in a changing climate and with some of these other shocks that we've been talking about. So we brought together different solutions and options for recovery following those prolonged rain and flooding periods, and yeah, looking at how different people are reacting to that. So in this discussion, each of our speakers will give us a 10-minute presentation, and then at the end there will be time for questions. So to kick us off, we've got Richard Smith, who is, as I mentioned, the host of a very popular monthly blog on agroecology. He's a farm manager at the diverse farming system at Daylesford in the Cotswolds, where they're integrating a number of crops and enterprises, and he's very passionate about breeding livestock for adapting to their environment and the farming system. So off you go, Richard. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Richard Smith here. I'm here in the Cotswolds. It's a beautiful sunny morning. So I was asked to talk a bit today about the challenges of wet winters, and I know that the following 2 speakers are going to talk more about arables. So I thought I'd talk more about the challenges of livestock farming through a wet and what has been a very mild winter. We actually drilled no autumn cereals last year, as did so many others. And my big challenge last September was to establish around 550 acres of grass clover lays. I don't know if you remember, but we got it in about the end of August, early September, and it went in dust, and there was no rain for 3 weeks, and that was a cause for concern. And then about the end of September, it started raining, and of course, didn't stop until about 3 weeks ago, and it was a huge worry because it was just poured and poured and poured. The grass didn't move at all, really. It just germinated and sat there. And then, interestingly, after Christmas, we had a mild spell and the grass got away. And now, ridiculously, of course, and ironically, I'm praying for a nice half an inch of rain to get it away. It's all established. It's all there. Actually, I had to walk around it yesterday. And it has got away. We have drilled some spring crops in the last couple of weeks, some spring barley and some oats and peas we've put in for a whole crop following the great drought of 2018. I grew a whole crop as an insurance, some oats and vetch, which was highly successful. And of course, again, ironically, last year would have been one of the growiest summers I've ever known. And the grass was in abundance. We're primarily a livestock farm, so we milk a pedigree herd of British Friesians. We have 2 farms actually, and between the 2 we lamb over 4,000 ewes and calve 500 beef cows. And we have a large poultry enterprise producing 5,000 table bird chickens a week, and we run a flock of about 6,500 laying hens. In a very, very wet winter, could I have the next slide, please? This is a site of Daylesford. This is the main Daylesford site. We have a very nice retail shop here and 4 shops in London. 100% of the produce that we produce goes through our own brand. We run our own abattoir and processing facility, and all of the product ends up in our own businesses. We also supply on to Ocado. Next slide, please. So this picture actually shows, it's a short video, and it's sitting on the edge of the River Evenlode. Now, this isn't actually terribly unusual to see this ground underwater, probably not quite as much as this. This is it floods onto permanent pasture, and that's actually some of the best permanent pasture we have. And I guess that's because of the flooding, we're getting this sort of nutrient that's being brought onto that floodplain there. It's a very natural floodplain. In the distance behind that water there at the top of the picture, an 800-acre block south of the farm, which is just very, very heavy clay. Now, if I chewed that out in the autumn to the bare boards, it'd be very, very slow getting away in the spring. So we always try and get livestock off of that pasture. It's mainly down to grass, and graze it on other parts of the farm because it damages so easily. I had a good walk around it in the last few weeks, and the water, of course, has put that grass in the lower spots under tremendous pressure. And the only way I've really tried to help it now is we've harrowed it, and I have overseeded some grass on the weaker spots. But it is amazing how well it will recover if it's looked after. On the very, very bad spots, I have actually got a direct drill, a more drill, and I'll drill some seed into the very worst affected areas. But that block generally sits very, very wet. It's quite an unusual piece of land for the Cotswolds. So permanent pasture has actually done very well and looks pretty normal to me, but those lays on the heavier land have definitely suffered, and there seems to have grown more moss than grass over the last few weeks through the winter. With a good harrowing and a sort up, it's actually changing now, and this bit of sunshine in the last fortnight has helped tremendously. Next slide, please. So with our livestock, I think this, for me, certainly, apart from not being able to get any winter cereal in, the biggest headache for me has been that it's been so mild as well. I mean, you could count the number of ground frosts we've had on one hand, and of course, it's the greatest defense against disease and bugs, of course, is a nice cold winter. So as a stock farmer, we always relish a nice dry, cold time. We're producing around 4,000 to 5,000 tons of manure every year. And you'd normally wait for a nice frosty time, you'd be able to get onto the ground and go and create a few muck middens halfway through the winter. Well, of course, that hasn't been able to happen. So I had to create areas where we could store muck safely. And I've tried to put it under cover. We've got some very nice covered yards that were built for silage pits, and as they've emptied, we've filled them up with muck and kept them in the dry to save any sort of effluent runoff. So we've had yards full of muck everywhere, and it's just in the last couple of weeks that we've been able to shift that and get that out. The biggest worry comes from housing livestock in mild weather. Cattle and sheep really just want to be outdoors, indoors, so the more airflow you've got through the building, the better. Cattle, as they come in, all get their backs clipped. It's quite a time-consuming job, but my goodness, does it help them out? And it really is worthwhile clipping the backs out of cattle. They'll sweat upon their backs. Younger animals will suffer from pneumonia. When we have variations of sort of 15 and 20 degrees from one day to the next, that's putting a huge amount of stress on the animal's metabolism. And if you don't keep an eye on that, you can run into a lot of trouble. We start calving our beef cows inside in February. We've had quite a lot of pneumonia in calves this time, and we've managed to stay on top of it, but it has been a worry and it is a headache. Next slide, please. Yeah, you seem to be on a green screen here. So it should be a picture of the sheep shed actually, but so sheep are housed. Any regular followers of Agri-ecology will see that I've put up a couple of blogs that actually talk about the benefits of shearing sheep. Now, obviously, in the winter, obviously you're not going to do that if you don't have the reasonable protective buildings and things and to keep them in and keep them nice and safe and dry. But I love it. We will house our sheep around Christmas, early January, shear them and then scan them. It saves a huge amount of stress in the summer trying to shear thousands of sheep with lambs at foot, makes it easier at lambing time, and this year the sheep have just been so comfortable in the house having been shorn. And that saves a huge amount of problems. Go back to my thing about stress and the fluctuations of temperatures, mild weather. Shear a sheep, put it into a house, keep it nice and dry, and it will thoroughly enjoy itself, and it has relieved a huge amount of stress. So that I would advocate every time, as long as you have the housing. If you're going to shear sheep in the winter, golden rule, make sure they've got 8 weeks of wool growth before you turn them out. We lamb on the 1st of April onwards, which is quite late compared to a lot of sheep farmers. And what that does is it gives me an almost guaranteed bite of grass to turn them out on. I think I'm right in saying that the last really cold winter we had, I think, was back in 2011, where we had quite a lot of snow. And it really did get quite cold and didn't warm up until sort of end of May. And even then, the ewes were fine when we turned them out, but they did have this, well, those in fact had around 10 or 12 weeks of wool growth. So I would advocate that every time. As I said, we have drilled some spring drilling this time, and now ridiculously we're praying for rain because nothing has emerged and it's rather dusty. And so that hopefully will happen this weekend. There's a little bit forecasted. Poultry. So I was hoping, I'm not actually seeing the slides now, Lydia, but I was going to talk a little bit about poultry. We have 6,500 laying hens in 12 houses here at Daylesford, and we run 40 houses with fattening birds up in Staffordshire. They're mobile houses, and they're running part of our agroforestry system here at Daylesford, which is working really, really well. Trees are encouraging foraging and grazing and ranging from the birds. One tip that I would give to people is that we actually source wood chip, or we'll chip wood ourselves on the farm, and we put it around the houses, and that acts as a sort of doormat for the birds. You can see, hopefully now you can see that slide. That's one of our mobile houses being moved across the field in part of the agroforestry system. So these are actually 500 bird houses, and the pullets come in at about week 15. They're interlaying about week 21. They stay on the farm until week 75. Then we deplete the house, and you can see this house being moved across the field, and you can see where the house sat on the far side of the field, and you just get this sort of muddy area around the house. So I learned a long time ago that if you put wood chip down outside the houses, it acts as a kind of doormat. The birds kind of enjoy scratching it, and they're not sort of taking a lot of mud into the house, and it does encourage ranging beautifully. You can see the trees planted either side there. They're a couple of years old now, so hopefully in the next few years they're going to mature into something rather more wonderful, and that really does encourage the birds to range across under those trees. And this system works really well. Where that house has been moved from now onto the next side of the field, this will be ploughed up, and Jez will then come in and grow brassicas on the fertility left behind by the birds. Have I had my 10 minutes, Lydia? There's the sheep shed, people. That's the one we missed out on. So that's about how the sheep shed looks at the moment, actually. We lambed about 1,500 ewes in this rather wonderful shed, and we're down to the last couple of hundred now. And of course, they are enjoying this glorious weather, and they're all being turned out within 24 hours of lambing. We lamb 1,200 commercial thlin ewes. It's a closed flock. Started the thlin flock about 15 years ago. And we've got to where we want to be with them now, just about. We've got a ewe that is very low maintenance. I spend very little on feed for them. They're on a 100% forage-based diet, and all lambs are fattened and finished. We grow kale crops in Staffordshire. I've always struggled to grow kale or turnips here in the Cotswolds, and that I'm throwing good money after bad crops, really. So we tend to stick in the better soils in Staffordshire, and we'll fatten a lot of lambs on kale up there. Down here, it's red clover lays, which is a fantastic finisher for lambs. Our business is set to grow considerably over the next few years, and I would always look to red clover and ryegrass lays to fatten those lambs. So it's working very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's really fascinating to see some of the innovative practices that Richard's putting in place there at a large scale at Daylesford. And I think the agroforestry system really demonstrates kind of how you can integrate these multiple functions and enterprises on one bit of land, really, and create that permanent cover and very sustainable system there. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Thank you. So just down the road is Ian Wilkinson at Honeydale Farm, 107 acres in the Cotswolds. And so Ian's going to tell us a bit about what he's putting into practice at Honeydale and Farm Ed, the new education centre. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Katie. Very good morning, everybody. Thanks, Richard, for a brilliant explanation of what's going on at Daylesford. I'm super impressed with Daylesford. I always have been. I think it's a wonderful place. And if you want to see agri-ecology on a very large scale, that's the place to go, because it's astonishing what you've done there. It's a complicated ecosystem, which I'm really impressed with. I'm at the other end of the scale with the farm that we have here. It's a smaller farm, but represents tens of thousands of farms of a similar size. And I just want to start by saying that from my point of view, I've been an agriculturalist for 35 years. Most of my time has been spent actually running a seed business. And I've learned so much from farmers who are practicing agroecological practices, regenerative style farming, and that sort of inspired me, really. So I'm really grateful to have had, been a participant, albeit from so literally looking over the fence. But as a result of that, I deal with, or my organisation deals with about 15,000 farmers on about 3 million acres. And it's, what strikes me is that over the period of time that I've been involved with farming, the change that's taken place in the last 10 years is quite astonishing. There are probably in my area of work about 25% of the people that I talk to would be practicing some form of regenerative style farming, and that's led me to think that we're on this sort of change cycle. And so what we've done ourselves is that we've taken on a small farm. This illustration here on the screen now is a sort of representation of how a resilient farming system might look. And if you look at it, without going into much detail, but if you just look at the sort of complexity of the different layers, exactly as Richard has been describing this morning, where the water system is connected to the soil, the livestock are connected to the arable, the fruit and the vegetables, as you've seen with Jez at Daylesford, are connected to the livestock cycles. Everything is connected. The whole thing is an ecosystem. And this illustration shows you in a very simple way how that might look. This illustration is in fact a real system at Farm Ed. This is exactly what we've done. We've taken an all arable and semi-permanent grassland system and transferred it to an agroecological farm. So what I'll show you now is a little bit of detail on the soil aspect of the work we're doing. There's a lot we could talk about, but I'm afraid we've only got a few minutes to discuss it. So I want to talk about some of the things that we've been thinking over the winter in terms of soils and resilience, and some of the things now, as Richard said, about going forwards into what appears to be a dry spring. Typical farmers, you know, you're never happy, are we? Anyway, Lydia, could I have the next slide, please? So on the left shows you the farm as it was, which was a continuous, on most of the ground was continuous cereal, a lot of spring cereals mostly on light land. And on the right shows you probably the single biggest change that we've made on the farm was to introduce livestock into the arable area. And these sheep represent a very easy way for farmers to have a transition from an all arable system. When I look across the valley, not towards Daylesford, but to other parts of our wonderful valley that we have this very broad, open valley, I can see, roughly speaking, 40 to 50% of the land is bare. And there is no soil, nothing worse than soil, you know, being exposed over the winter, as we know. And it didn't stop raining from October onwards. There was no opportunity to get back to this land. And so we are left here in this part of the Cotswolds with very little green cover. Everyone anticipated that we would, or thought we would get into, you know, to sow these areas, but they're not sown. And now here we are with a dry spring. And from an economic perspective, my guess is that it won't be viable to plant cash crops onto impoverished land. A lot of this land is grade 3 average stuff, and it's so badly depleted, it's quite difficult to see how you can grow viable crops unless you build soil fertility. And that's why those sheep are so important in our system. The sheep come onto the farm, they're not our sheep, they're a local farmer's son's sheep. He has 900 ewes. He spreads them around a number of farms, including ours, which means that we can use them tactically to manage our fertility building cycle within our rotation. Can I go to the next slide, please, Lydia? I want to just show you the difference between an illustration again between a simple monoculture cereal and a complex deep rooting lay that the livestock can graze. It's really striking when you dig soils and you look to the differences in the root structures as to how much you see. What of course is happening there is that there's a cycle going on, there's nitrogen being fixed, there's a huge amount of carbon sequestration going on, and of course the livestock might be considered by some arable farmers as a byproduct, but actually is a very useful cash crop ultimately when the livestock are moved on. But I need those livestock more than people realize, because I don't know any other way of building soil fertility that lasts unless you've got livestock in the system. And it's all well and good putting on synthesized fertilizers, but we know they're very temporary, and of course they have lots of environmental impact too. This type of farming system where the lay is embedded is really critical to the success of our farming systems going forward. But it also gives us huge resilience. We've got pretty much 100% ground cover on the farm, pretty much all year round. There are times, of course, when we re-establish things where there's temporary loss of green cover. But if you look at our farm at the moment, and I dare say at the other farms that we're Richards and Phil's farm in a moment, that most of the ground is covered. And I think that we should unpack that a little bit later on in discussion, because I think it's really quite different to a monoculture simple farming system. Can I go to the next slide, please, Lydia? So this is an aerial shot of, was taken last summer. And so if you look across the top of the picture, you can see strips. So this is our strip farmed rotation. It just really, I just wanted to illustrate to you that the way in which you integrate a crop rotation, whereby you have multiple crops within a crop rotation, so that you are building fertility, and that every time a wheat or an oat or whatever goes in, it's harnessing the fertility that's built by the forage crops. Very important for our farm to do this, because there is no inherent fertility in the soil. Organic matter levels are really, really low. So what we have been doing since 2013 is building soil fertility with this little sheep flock that you can see ringed here. Now we have at any one time up to about 100 ewes on the farm. It's a small farm, don't forget. So 100 ewes for us is sufficient to manage our forage areas. You'll see that group is moving every 24 hours. Each of those little blocks through what looks like a blue area, that's actually chicory flowers, is about 1/4 of an acre. And roughly speaking, when we've got 100 ewes, we move them every 24 hours to about 1/4 of an acre. We go around about every 40 to 50 days. Rob Havard will give you some more information on this perhaps later on. Rob, if you wanted to chip in, it'd be great. And we have a defoliation policy that pretty much grazes half of it, leaves half of it, carbon sequestration, more leaf for photosynthesis to regrow, and then we move the sheep on. So we're getting huge amounts of biodiversity on our farming system. We're getting good production from the sheep, and we're building soil fertility. So for me, this is the key to success, is to have this integration of livestock into an arable system. I'm not going to bore you the rest of the rotation. We can talk about it later on if you like, but for me, the most important part, 50% of the time, 4 years out of our 8-year crop rotation, is building fertility. And that is absolutely essential. It's how farming systems have always been for 400 generations. And it's only in the last 200 generations that we've decided to separate our fertility building livestock from our arable crops. And that's going to prove to be a big mistake. So we need to reintegrate them. And I believe this is a very quick way of doing just that. Lydia, could I have the next slide, please? I want to just mention briefly how we get this green cover as continual as we possibly can. On the left-hand side, this is a photograph of a white clover that was sown last year underneath wheat. Now, the little inset picture shows you a close-up shot of the white clover, which shows some wheat coming through, which was direct drilled 1 month ago. This photograph was taken just very recently. You can see the wheats coming through, you can see the clovers there, and our idea is to, and the photograph on the right shows you how it should work out come later on in the year. That's actually a crop of oats, and it's actually a crop of red clover underneath it. But can you see the benefit, the synergy between the two things? Not being particularly affected by the clover, but we've got this lovely green cover. We've used a direct drill to drill into it. I don't know whether that bit on the left is going to work yet, but this is the sort of work we're trying to develop to allow us to have continual green crops. You could call it a living mulch. I'm sure there's lots of other terminology, but basically that's white clover that's been there for a while with a cereal direct drilled into it. And if you get the timings right, it can work. Lydia, can I have the next slide, please? This shows you the sort of, again, a simplistic view. But what's important to note is on the right-hand side, we're not using any inputs on our farm. This is not organic land, but we are a zero input farm. So we're trying to grow our own nitrogen fertilizer by using the legumes. We're trying to grow our own protein by grazing those legumes after harvest with our sheep. And of course, we're trying to grow grain crops, in this case, within the living mulch. And I believe this is the future. Could I move on, please, Lydia? As far as grazing is concerned, the picture on the left shows you how we go into very tall grass, perhaps 40, 50 days between grazings. So you can see the sheep are in there, you can't really see them. And on the right is not how we want to do things. We want to outwinter everything. We don't have buildings here for our animals, but we don't want to go through to bare soil, and we don't really want to be feeding hay. We do make a bit of hay on the farm, but we want to have the animals grazing in situ, because that's by far the cheapest way of growing livestock. But we don't want bare soil. So the benefit of having our sheep that come in, and with our young neighbour, he will move those sheep onto other ground if we ask him. So we don't charge him a lot for for keep, but we ask him to be flexible and to help us so that we're not overgrazing land. And there's huge areas in the Cotswolds where these sheep can go, which currently don't have any livestock. So land area is not a problem. We need low levels of livestock moving around very large areas of arable, in my view. Could I have the next slide, Lydia, please? And finally, this resilient to extremes, I think Richard summed it up. We have had this really big problem, and I'm sure Phil's going to carry on with this in a moment, but a big problem between wet winters, dry springs and summers. Every few years we get one extreme or another. And you combine all those together, it really does lower your average batting score, if you like. What I think is really important, and what a lot of scientific work has been looking at, is how we can get resilient systems. And this is Lydia Smith, who I believe is also in our group today. My favourite scientist, I call Lydia, because she really does have a good handle on everything that's going on, from an agro-ecological perspective right through to big agricultural production in East Anglia. And Lydia, I hope you chip in later on, because I think you will make some really good points. But for me, what's important here is that the work that I've seen Lydia and been involved with Lydia looking at is how a lot of the forgotten plant species that we use can be reintroduced into this new form of agriculture with wonderful success. This is sandfoin behind us here, which is a wonderful fertility building crop. I know others, Richard, I know you've got some at Daylesford. It's a fabulous crop for building fertility. It's a wonderful livestock crop. It's a drought resistant crop. It's a carbon capturing crop. It's an anthelmintic crop. It's a protein source. It should be, these type of plants should be being used on massive areas. So I'll have to stop there, I'm afraid. I think probably I've used my allotted time slot, but thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hang on for questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's another fascinating example of how that diversity enables your capacity to adapt to changing conditions, and these kind of, like you say, sandfoin, these crops that have all these different functions in an integrated system. So really fascinating. I think as well, there's huge potential with flying stock and getting livestock in arable, which we're really seeing a lot of movement of in the east of England as well now. So I think there's huge potential in that. So thanks for sharing your experiences, and look forward to hearing more about how you get on with that yellow trefoil and white clover as well. It's really interesting. I think it seems to work well in France, and there's really a growing interest here in the UK as well. So thank you so much, Ian. So next up is Phil Jarvis, who's Head of Farming at the Game and Wildlife Trust Allerton project, where they're utilising a biological approach in conservation agriculture. So yeah, look forward to hearing a bit more about that now. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Katie. Now there's a fine looking fellow on that opening slide. Hasn't aged a bit in 20 years. So welcome. There's quite a few faces I recognise and names I recognise, but a lot of you will be familiar with the Allerton project. 800 acres in old money, 320 hectares in new money, but we're farming with our neighbour, probably in the region of 2,000 acres of arable land in total. But if we can move on to the first slide, please. Addressing a wet winter, and as a couple of the other speakers have mentioned, as I was writing these few slides, it was less and less rain, and it was really talking about how can we have a resilient farming approach to both drought and flood. So whilst I talk about the wet weather, please bear in mind that these swings that we're seeing are very, very pronounced, and on our land particularly can have some really major effects. And I think the things that Ian and Richard have talked about are the sort of things that we will probably need to get better at. So if we go to the next slide, the first thing on heavy land is if you don't get your drainage right, any of these systems that rely on regenerative agriculture and less cultivation, you're going to end up with problems. That's just, you know, a month ago, I was mending these drains around the farm. We did about 15, 16, 17 of them. The last one is one I pictured when it was actually dry and we could actually get anywhere near it. But repairing drains on heavy soils really paramount before you even start thinking about how, you know, you have to get water away. If it sits on clay soils, we line our fields with clay to make ponds. But and I bought a few props, so it's always good to have a trusty spade, okay, and a decent pair of Wellington boots when you're on this land at Nottington, because boy, you're going to need them if you're going to deal with some of the winter issues you have. I'd also just talk about soil. I've got a bit of soil here as well, and this is soil that I would, you know, there's a lump of soil here, but if I drop it, well, a month ago this would have been sludge. I drop it now, bone dry. So the problems that both Richard and Ian have talked about, some of the agriculture we're going to talk about is trying to minimize those and mitigate those. Next slide, please. Yeah. So cultivations and drilling. So we're always looking to, you know, some of our cover crops we drill into. Now, Ian mentioned about keeping green cover. It's one of the areas that we have a lot of stubble and a lot of straw that we chop and leave. So even if our fields haven't got cover crops on them, they've got stubble on them. Sometimes drilling time is really crucial. If you're getting cover crops in and drilling things in the middle of August compared to the end of August, that 2 weeks of solar energy, light, heat makes a massive difference. So when you're trying to put things, if farmers are putting things in at the end of August and the middle of September, the amount of cover you've got is going to be reduced, and we found that a struggle. But we do try and direct drill into all our stuff. So where a lot of our neighbours have had cultivated work seed beds, most of ours have either had straw or a cover crop of some type on it. Next slide, please. So like many of the others, the first top left is part of our herbal lays, and I have to admit, you know, this has been the main diet of a lot of arable organic systems for a number of years. And I think it's now becoming a mainstay. And you'll see from the cropping diagram on the right, the light green patches are where we're beginning to introduce this more around the farm. There were some of our cover crops in the bottom left that were taken last November. Not particularly great, simply because they went in too late at the first day of September, last days of August. But like Richard, my whole farm is in spring cropping. The orange winter wheat crops there are spring sown. We've yet to see whether they'll vernalise as well, and we've yet to see whether they'll fully come through. Some of the fields are coming through, but it's mainly barley, oats, spring wheat, and some winter beans. The winter beans happen to be part of last year's winter bean crop. They look so good, we decided to keep them. So watch this space. So you'll see on our heavy land, that is a real challenge for us, because, you know, this land goes from extremely wet to extremely dry very quickly. And as I've illustrated, you know, if you don't keep a cover on it, it can dry out. Next slide, please. So whilst we've drilled everything with spring crops, we've also realized that some of our compacted headlands around the outsides of fields are never going to really yield a lot. So most 10 meters around every field is either going to have a summer pollinator mix sown in it, which will be going in the next few weeks, or a soil structuring mix. So we don't want to really spend a lot on inputs in there, but we do think that we can help up the soil and provide something for pollinators around the farm, which really means that we're going to get a better margin from those headlands rather than losing money. And of course, there may well be some scope in the future to putting a lot of what I've talked about in agri-environment schemes. And I'll just pick up one of the comments that Jane's made as well. We're talking about here resilient farming systems. We really do have to marry this with how we talk about our environmental land management going forward and the marketplace that we're selling these. We need a much more resilient marketplace, if you like, an environmentally sensitive marketplace. It is no use us throwing away milk, having swings and encouraging this sort of farming system if our markets can't support it properly. So government, marketplace and farmers all have to play their share in there, not relying on particularly just one sector to get there. And the next slide. So this is my final slide, and really this is about the use of technology. And of course, the first picture there is about using guidance on our tractors. So that's much more efficient use of fuel and actually compaction linked with low tire pressure as well. And when I say I'm driving and drilling it, the tractor's really doing it itself. And also with drone technology, which is quite new to us. And some of the other speakers have used drone footage. And I think that looking at the bottom right picture there, getting real-time information rather than waiting for yield maps at the end of the season will be able to tell us whether or not we can manipulate inputs during the season. So that's how we're addressing whether that's how our agroecological approach is going. We can do more on soil cover, but we've got the basics there of a wide rotation. We've got reduced cultivations, soil cover we're building on, and yes, we've got my neighbours ewes and some of my Leicester Longwolls, rare breed for a reason, but they're grazing the agroforestry. So I think just talking about technology, I've got the drone here, so probably if we could probably put it up now and see whether what the farm looks like over the weekend, and it is quite dry. So let's take it away with the next slide if it'll work. So here we go. This is some of our woodland that's been cleared. These are some of our cover crops, and you'll see that actually the field just in front of you there did have a cover crop in it, did have chopped stubble into it, but so with our drilling and the dry weather, it does look quite bare. But our organic matters are sitting at 6% on heavy land farm. That's quite high, but of course we need some rain. You'll see we're flying over now some agroforestry. The Leicester Longwolls are going to have that as their habitat or home this summer. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of what's going on at Loddington. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Phil. And yeah, totally agree with your point that we were asking the question, how do you deal with a wet winter? But this is more of an issue of creating more resilient farming approaches as we spring between droughts and floods. And I think that's been a common point across all three farms here, is that we're not just talking about a wet winter, we're looking to create these resilient systems that can adapt to extremes. So now a dry spring, and also other shocks, agronomic shocks, markets, economic shocks, things like what we're going through now, the kind of transformative effects of that. So, and it's also quite interesting that each farm is quite different, which I think demonstrates the diversity of ways that people are putting agroecological approaches into practice, adapting that to local conditions, the context of farm, business, and their own market. So yeah, really interesting. It also demonstrates a range of approaches in the agroecology community. So we're all about sustainable, practical farming beyond labels, and the exchange of experiences between all farmers about what works. So really kind of bridging across the sector. So thank you. That was fascinating presentations there. And so we'll open up for questions, comments, points of clarification. You can either put your hand up or put something in the chat. And if you can just say who you are when you get started, that would be great. I'm just going to kick off with one question which I had come up in the chats, which was around groundswell. We do normally host Agri-ecology tent at Groundswell. We're still awaiting confirmation that that's going to be cancelled, but we will be looking at hosting those discussions online. So yeah, I'll take a question from Lydia. So you've got your hand up there, Lydia Smith.
So I just wanted to ask a question, I guess first of Ian, and maybe Phil would have some comments too, about the importance of soil types. So as some of you know, we've got a multi-partner project looking at the impact of these herbal lays on soil structure and quality, and whether it's important to have livestock in the system or whether you can get away with just mowing. But my question relates to how do you tweak A, the species mixture, and perhaps B, the management according to the soil type that you have? And Phil, for example, mentioned that he's got a very heavy site. So we've got one of our tests on his farm, but we've got an even heavier one down at our STAR project in Suffolk, where some of these species begin to struggle, particularly the sandfoin components, for example. They struggle with the deep, wet conditions that the roots encounter, which they're less keen on. So I guess, yeah, what do you think, Ian, about A, the species mixture, and then perhaps B, the management?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Lydia. It's funny, I mean, I've worked all my time with mixtures of species together, and the first thing to say is that you've got to have very diverse mixtures, very diverse types of plants. Otherwise, you don't get the benefits of using a mixture. So you have to have very distinct plants, let's say, in the simplest terms, early growing ones, late growing ones. You have a range of quite a big range of species that you can choose from, but some of them are limited by soil type. So, for example, some plants, and sandfoin is a good example, do not like very wet, waterlogged conditions, nor do they like necessarily acidic conditions. Some do. So it's a question really of choosing species which are well suited, but very different to other species in the mix. So there'd be little point in having one species. With fertility building and livestock, feeding livestock, we really do need to have very different species to get as much photosynthesis as possible, to as much carbon capture as possible. Some, of course, fix nitrogen, some don't. Some might make phosphate available, some don't. And the list goes on and on and on. So we need the diversity to get the result. We have to, with our local knowledge, decide which plant species are right. And this is where, partly through first-hand experience, now generations ago would have known this, they wouldn't have had to ask for information. It would have been known in the district what plants would grow. We're now in a situation where the knowledge has been lost and we're having to relearn it, which is why your work, Lydia, is very important. So I would say, yes, I think you identified a real problem here, but the work you're doing particularly is going to solve the problem. And I think don't also underestimate the management, because if you're, you might get your species right, but then you can kill half of them by mismanaging them. And whether with livestock or without, my personal view is that if you're really going to get the benefit into the soil, you have to have the livestock. Without livestock, whether, if we're feeding an AD plant or if we're just cutting and mulching, it's much better. And as Phil said, these lays are much more effective than cover crops. The lays are really the key to it. So we must find out more and more and more about how we use the diverse lays to solve our current problem with soil. So yes, the mixtures need tweaking, but it's very, very localized. And that's where specific knowledge comes in. But it is there, and we're building it, and we just need to get it out through channels like Agri-ecology, as we're doing today. But it has to be field by field, and we tailor it to each situation.
Can I just add a couple of sentences there, really? Lydia, what we found is that things like chicory, some of the clovers and plantains do quite well on our land. Obviously, the lighter the soil, the more diversity in the sward. And my second comment would be about cutting and grazing. I'd love to graze it, and we do have lots of it grazed by a next door neighbour. I'm still thinking, if we want to encourage this into the swathes of East Anglia, that non-cutting regimes supported by agri-environment schemes, fertility building, less reliance on fertiliser still has a place. And once again, having a huge marketplace for, or suddenly introducing much more livestock, we may well struggle with marketing this. So that's what my points are about resilient marketplace. And thanks for that, and thanks for the comment, Alistair, about I wasn't flying the drone, but my assistant manager was. I think you'd be seeing a lot of pictures of it stuck in trees if I was growing it.
Phil, I just want to add to what you said, Phil. I think you're dead right about this marketplace situation. Of course, we need support from the marketplace. A lot of us are involved with that work, and I totally agree with you. But for me, what it's about is having less density of livestock and less frequency of grazing, but still using them as the management tool. So I'll give you some hope. I was in East Anglia just before COVID-19 struck, and we had a big conference organised by IOF, And anyway, 120 farmers there, all of them looking to reintroduce livestock into East Anglia. I was staggered by the enthusiasm. It was the best day I've been to for a long time. So I think it is happening, but it's got to be low numbers. Otherwise, the market will be flooded with livestock. We need low numbers, infrequently grazing. But that's the way, surely. I mean, it's such a cheap system, and it would introduce so many young people into agriculture. And it's, we know there's massive barriers. We need to reduce those barriers to get young people in. And this is such a brilliant way of doing it. The employment opportunities on farms are massive if we can have relatively low levels of livestock per acre or hectare, but across the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Add one little tiny bit of stock news. Early results from that work we're doing suggest that with livestock in the system, there may be better control of blackgrass, but watch this space.
I'm definitely seeing that at home. Yeah, getting lays in the system on the arable farm in East Anglia, definitely helping us get on top of the blackgrass. Anecdotally. So I do just have to say, I'm aware some people need to leave at 9:45, so just a message from Jane to say email her or WhatsApp her to catch up. I've had a few questions come through on here. So one question from Charlie was, I think a lot of this is for Phil, I think a lot of growers are put off by technology due to its complexities. How difficult, easy have you found introducing drones within your system? Picked up on that a bit earlier.
Well, I think just like Zoom, if you're in all these video conferences, I think Zoom's probably one of the best I've got to, and some of the other technologies less so. And I think it's the same on farm. I think they're getting there. I think there will be ways of making us more efficient with technology. And to pick up on Ian's comment, the fact that the younger generation and looking after livestock, the younger generation can look after the technology a bit better than I can. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for those that are used to being brought up in that. So I think there's a place for it. I think definitely it can improve our efficiency and give us real-time information. So no, I'm a great fan of it, not necessarily DEFRA using it and the RPA using it, because I think I make it too complicated, but I think well proven and investing a lot of money in it, yeah, thumbs up from me.
Brilliant. And then another question from Richard is, by adopting an agroecology approach, are you finding that you can drill later in the autumn than neighbours who don't follow this approach? I guess that's a question for all of you.
I think we're dependent on the weather. I think if it had been 20 years ago, I think a lot of heavy land farmers would have all been drilled up because they wouldn't have been waiting on blackgrass. It's all been due to the fact that rather than drilling in the middle of September, people are trying to drill in the middle of October. And in the third week of September, the heavens opened, and quite frankly, they didn't stop until about 4 weeks ago. So I think from that point of view, yeah, I think certainly, I think soil type has a big part to play, and I'm not sure we can get away with it much more than our neighbours. But I know our soil is in better condition than some of our neighbours who've perhaps left no cover.
Yeah.
As an organic farmer, I love to drill a little bit later anyway. The later you can get it in, the corn will emerge and the weeds are going in the opposite direction. But the point made by Phil about soil type is the obvious one. If the forecast was fairly dry into October, I would try and drill later as an organic farmer.
One other thing to add in as well, of course, is that if you've got more diversity within the cropping, you haven't got the pressures of a single crop being required to be sown in one go. And if you think of, for example, winter wheat and oilseed rape this autumn, a lot of winter wheat didn't get sown across the whole of the country, and a lot of the oilseed rape failed, big time. And so we've got a dysfunctioning arable farming system this year. There's going to be, and if that was, if that's replicated across large areas of land, we've got food security issues. So I think it's, I think this is multifaceted, but I believe that if you are, in our case here, we don't have a big acreage, but we have a lot of very small areas. It's very easy for us to literally nip in and out and sow when we want to harvest when we want to, without massive pressure of one single crop, overwhelming us. So,
yeah. Fantastic, thank you, Ian. We've got another question here. What are the economic cost benefits of a more regenerative approach, and what might be the first steps for farmers starting out? To comment on that, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, the first thing is cash in the bank. Cash at the moment, as we're seeing with COVID-19, is key to success in business. If you haven't got cash in the bank, you're in trouble. Land is so expensive, you know, to buy. I bought land recently, and I know how expensive it is. It is a real barrier to entry. So if you're farming in an agro-ecological way, you have very low cost in terms of your initial expenditure. So you're not, very often, you're not buying fertilizers, and you're not buying synthesized pesticides. So, you know, you have a low cost of production. That's the first thing. So you leave your money in your bank. So it's not about yield necessarily. It's about building a system that is generating, self-generating, self-sufficient farming, which then leaves money in your bank account. And I think that's brilliant for new entrants. I think it's brilliant for existing farmers. But I do fully appreciate that we are already vested in a system that is highly capitalized, and moving from that to a regenerative agro-ecological system, you know, it takes time. We have to, as Phil says, we need to fund a transition. It's really important that not only government leads this, but the consumer does as well. And we need a two-way interaction, as Phil said absolutely correctly. Daylesford is a really good example. Agri-ecology is a really good example of how we can do it together. And this collaboration is the key. None of us can do it individually. We need to all pull together on this.
I would just add there that if you're a heavy land farmer and you want to go down this approach, you've got to make sure your drainage is right. I like the idea of introducing livestock. I think, and the clever use of agri-environment schemes and environmental land management in the future to actually try. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If we want to have a climate-friendly farming approach, then let's start supporting the things we're talking about this morning and supporting the marketplace. And the final thing is on fixed costs. If you have a highly mechanized system that, you know, don't change to a direct drilling system or a low input system or an agri-ecology and keep all your equipment, and then say, well, and after 2 years say, well, my costs are too high, it hasn't worked. Get rid of your equipment, use contractors, and reduce your fixed costs to say, and that will help you in transition. So that would be my sort of 4 points about getting into these sorts of systems. Don't have a lot of machinery.
Yeah.
Or appropriate machinery.
Absolutely. I just had a comment from Tom Allen Stevens asking if we could talk a bit more about blackgrass and how livestock can help, and that he understands there's a problem with how blackgrass is adapting to how it's grazed. But if that's something you've got any experience with, Lydia, or anybody else?
I'm an expert on growing blackgrass. I would say that we've done 4-year lays and we've reduced blackgrass numbers, but difficulty is it is, you know, you're talking about a weed that has thousands and thousands of seed heads on it. Yeah, no, I think there are, no, grazing it, topping it. There are some approaches to it, and it definitely does work with livestock grazing. Lydia, I don't know if you've got any experience in this area.
And which Lydia you're asking?
Yeah, but Lydia, yes, Smith, Lydia.
Yeah. So we in our multi-plot experiment, we're contrasting grazing versus mowing, and all other, you know, treatments are the same. So we're quite early on in the collection of data, but the surveys that we did this spring certainly suggest there's less blackgrass in the grazed treatments than in the mowed treatments, and everything else is the same. We've got the same lay which was planted at the same time on the same field. So we'll wait and see, because it really is early data. We haven't done any of the stats on it yet, and we haven't surveyed all the sites. So we're definitely going to come up and look at what's happening in Loddington. If that shows the same as what's happening at Duxford, it would be quite exciting. And
it's worth adding, Lydia, that the first crops and second crops after these grazed, you know, the reduction in fertilizer, the reduction in plant protection products is very noticeable, and that has got to be the right approach.
Just an observation here from experience. About 6 years ago, I grew a crop of winter wheat on one 90-acre field, which has an infestation of blackgrass on our farm. Very luckily, we don't have it in other areas on the farm, but this one field does suffer. It goes from light to heavy country. There was a field of winter wheat, and the blackgrass was very definitely there and didn't take a lot of finding, and that was a concern. That then went into a fertility building lay or a grazing lay, and was down for 5 years. Last year we grew a spring barley crop on it. The key to all of this farming is moisture at the right time. With it you can grow crops. Without it, it's a real struggle. Last year, as I said before, was a fantastically growy season here in the Cotswolds for us. We grew a spring crop. I don't fully understand the life cycle of blackgrass because it's not high on my agenda here, but we grew a spring crop of spring barley. It did 3 tonne to the acre, very, very clean, not a sight of blackgrass. In the 5 years that it was down to this grazing lay, fertility building lay, we would have mowed it twice every year for silage and then grazed it right up as long as we could into the back end of the year. So that's just my experience of blackgrass and how we've managed to get on top of it. I will also add that the wild oats reappeared.
Anecdotally, there's no doubt that farmers generally don't have big infestations of any one weed problem if they have diverse farming systems. It strikes me, and having listened to so many farmers over the years, you gain a very detailed picture of the countryside. Without any doubt, diverse farming systems, mixed farming, if you like, don't have these pressures that monoculture, simple farming systems have.
Yeah.
I think it would be fair to say as well that you're not, if you want to transition from a blackgrass situation straight away into a regenerative system, sometime they're going to have to be, you may well have to have some interventions, which just doesn't mean you have a catch crop the next year. You can't switch from one bad problem with slugs and blackgrass and expect these approaches to solve it overnight. So you have to be prepared to, give your new system its best opportunity and chance.
And Rob, sorry.
As you know, I'm a huge fan of samfoin, and in fact today we are drilling 80 acres of samfoin. I'll go back to Ian's point about lower density stocking. Samfoin isn't a crop that you can punish in the winter with sheep and hammer. Red clover is a much different crop. We can get lambs doing 250, 300 grams a day live weight gain on red clover, and you can treat it badly and it will reappear to a point. Samfoin, you need to be really careful with it. But the payback for me is this high quality forage in bulk. So when we mow silage, red clover, ryegrass, you're getting about 10 tons. This is organically, obviously, you're getting about 10 tons of fresh weight silage to the acre. With the samfoin, it's 15 tons, and the protein and the MEs are just off the scale compared to red clover and ryegrass. So diverse lays, I have grown, diverse lays, and some plants will do really well, some don't do so well. And go back again to Ian's point about soil types and farm structures. This farm here is as different as the farm next door. They're all completely unique. Whether you're farming in Devon or Northumberland is one thing. It's here. This farm is completely different to the one next door. One of the reasons I got into samfoin in the original, some years ago, I was talking to a chap up the road that lived here his entire life. He's in his 80s, and he showed me a map of his farm that was, made back in 1920, whatever. And half the fields in the rotation were covered in samfoin. So I don't need to rewrite the book that the Cotswolds and Cotswold type soils are a good place to grow samfoin. And I think that's really important. The more work that Lydia can do and this research that happens to tell us what is good to grow on our farms is really, really useful.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm conscious that we've got some more questions, but we're running out of time. So I think I'll wrap up, and then if people wanted to stay on and ask more questions, perhaps we can do it that way if anyone had some kind of urgent questions. But I think the kind of common theme here is that there is no magic wand. You know, we're looking to build resilience in a whole system approach. And there are lots of people out there making these approaches work and learning from each other, trialing things at a small scale, seeing what works on your own farm and farm context, and kind of bringing together people from across the sector, really. And so Agri-ecology is there. It's a free online resource that farmers can use during lockdown. So everyone will be able to get out into the field virtually. And we invite you all to get involved. We'd love you to come along to a field day, look through the videos on our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and keep in touch. And do let us know if you've got a topic that you would like to go into in an article. If you'd like to work with us, then do keep in touch. Lydia Lishman, do you want to say a few words about kind of the next steps in terms of the press release and so on?
Yeah, just very quickly, we'll be sending out a press release after this, and the recording of this whole press conference will be available as well. And the contact details to get in touch with us directly are in there. And ahead of the events, our first virtual event, we'll get in touch with you and we'll send you out the joining details for anyone who wants to participate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days, and yeah, do keep in touch. And if anyone does have any questions they want to ask, perhaps unmute yourself and we can ask now. But otherwise, we will be in touch.